Hi, today I'm going to be taking a contrabassoon reed blank, and I'm going to be gradually working it into a position where it's a playable reed. So let's see where we want to go from this. Okay, there are a couple things that I want to do on a blank. One is that I want to ream it. Okay, and so the reamer that I use is just like with a bassoon reed. I use a tapered drill bit for placing pilot holes for screws, wood screws. And this one happens to be a 1/4 inch diameter. It works very well for contrabassoon. I don't have a collar on here like I do for a bassoon, but I have marked, very possibly you can see it. There are some black marks on this that show me how deep I should be reaming. So not too much more than where this reed came out to be. Okay, so I've cleaned up that hole. And again, just like with bassoon, we're going to have the situation where these fibers are compressed in the process of forming the reed, and so I'm going to have to ream it again later on. Okay, so now I want to swap out my reamer for mandrel. And again, I'm just using a standard bassoon mandrel. And I'm going to now make this so that it is roughly the right length. Okay, so wrong side. I'm going to make this at 2 3/4 inches to start with. Okay, that's a little bit long, but just like with bassoon, I like to have 3/4. Just like with bassoon, I like to start out a little bit long, do some work on it, and then shorten it to the correct length. I'm also going to mark on here where my shoulder is, and for me that's 1 3/8. I'll provide the metric equivalents to those on the video or in the material below. Okay, so making a shoulder. I'll need to make a shoulder on both sides, so I better mark it on both sides. 1 3/8. Okay, so again, I like having a sharp shoulder. I think it gives the reed a nice chance to vibrate correctly, and if you just work with what's coming off your profiler, it's who knows what it looks like. You know, it's not an even sort of thing. Okay, so you've seen me do this on bassoon reeds. Just again, my knife is such that it's only sharpened on one side, or the bevel is only on one side, so I can lay it flat against the reed and just fold things up a little bit, and things work nicely. Okay, that shoulder worked pretty well. I'm going to clean it up a little bit with a file. A flat file works just fine. This happens to be a square section file, but like I said, a flat file works just fine. And then going on to the other side. Okay. The one thing that you don't want to do when you're doing this is to make an indent right where the shoulder starts. You want it just to smoothly go along and then make the transition. Okay, and now I want to trim this to the length that I made, that I marked on here. And let's see, well, shadows are hard to get around, but I'm just going to bring this up in here. Okay, so I've got it centered. I'm going to raise the blade, push it in, lower the blade a little bit. There we are. I'm right on the mark. I've got the bead centered, and I flip it off. and I want to take my nippers and cut off the corners just so I don't catch them on anything. And just as the same with bassoon reeds, I cut off my corners very small. Okay, so far so good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape this. I'm going to go away here for a while. I'm going to scrape this to a set of my very neat handwriting here. You can see that I can do that. I'm going to scrape this to a set of a profile that I've predetermined. And again, my dial indicator is in thousandths of an inch, and the markings along its edge, I don't know if you can see, but there are markings along the this probe that goes into the reed, and those are they start at a 1/16 of an inch and go every 1/8 of an inch. So those are the markings that I'm going to give you. You'll see them on the top of the video. And if you don't happen to have those things down below, I have fit a second order polynomial to it, and you can determine what the thickness ought to be at various distances using that polynomial, and it's there in both English units, inch units, and metric units in millimeters. So you can use those and make easy conversions. So that's all for now. Be back in a few minutes. Okay, I'm back. Let's just see what we did here. I did cut this off, and I was trying to cut it off at 2 3/4. And well, I cut it off a little bit short. So that's not quite 2 3/4. It's a 2.73, and it's a 2.75. Okay, so I've done that. I've scraped it to my prescribed dimensions. It crows fairly well, and that's okay. Again, I like to bend my wires so that my reed smiles at me, and this is the direction that I think is smiling, and that's my frowning direction. So this is my smiling direction. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to curl the wire around so that I can always tell which is my up direction. And then that wire is a little long, so I'll trim it off. And then fold down the other wire. Okay, so now it's pretty obvious what's happening. Okay, so I've done this. I've wet the reed. I opened up the opening a little bit from where it was. It was pretty closed. I've got my dimensions kind of close, and we'll see what happens with that. And I'll play a few notes on the contrabassoon. Again, I'm using just a cell phone here, so you have to bear with the tone quality. Okay, so it plays up and down pretty much the range. I've forgotten some of the fingerings, but that's okay. It's a little bit long. It's not very vibrant, and so I'm going to shorten it to the top of my tolerances, and we'll see what that is. The top of my tolerance is 2.720, and like I said, this is about 8 thousandths or so long, and so I'm going to trim that down using my reed tip clipper. And again, I do this the same way that I did with bassoon. I start out with my reed in here with the blade down. I measure the total length using my dial caliper. Okay, and I've got that distance, and whatever number this turns out to be, I said that the reed was about 8 thousandths too long, so I'm going to wind down 8 thousandths out of this. So that's 15, so I should go down to about 7, and we'll see how that works. So I'm twisting this little wheel down here and moving it slowly. Oops, too far. So back it out again. Okay. Got things in the center. Yep, okay, and down to about 7. Slowly, 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 slowly. Okay, there we are. And make sure I'm centered. And cut off the tip. And these are okay. Clip my edges again, my corners. See if the crow has changed any. And the crow is distinctly higher. Okay, so I'm going to soak that for a little while. I'm going to, again, go down to the measurements that I think are good in the center, and we'll see what's happening with the reed then. Okay, so I worked this down to the measurements, the center line measurements that are specified, that I've specified, and basically I opened the tip a little bit more. And we've already cut it to the top of my tolerance measurements, and it crows now fairly nicely. And I'll play a chromatic scale for you, and you can see what you think of that. So we're playing the range from low B flat to high C. Not too bad, not real vibrant, kind of muffled sound. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to measure the reed. Again, I've just been working with centerline measurements, and just like I did with bassoon, I'm going to now add on measurements on the side. So I've done the centerline measurements at 1/16, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, 16, 19, I think, and probably 21. And what I'm going to do is now I'm going to go and I'm also going to measure it halfway between the center and the edge on both sides at each one of those markers. And then at the edge for the closest 3, 1/16, 3/16, and 5/16. Okay, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to map it out and see what happens, and I'll do that on both sides of the reed. So this will take me a little bit to do, but I'll be back when that's done. Hi, I'm back. I've just finished making measurements. I actually did some scraping after the measurements. But what I did was I made 36 measurements on each side of the reed, basically starting at 1/8 of an inch and going or 1/16 of an inch and going every 1/8 down the center line, and halfway between the center line and the side on each side, and then the 1/16, 3/16, and 5/16 spaces on the edges of the reed. And so this is my set of measurements that I came up with when I did that. They're pretty good. I do have some sections here where Again, as I did with my bassoon reed, I box the areas where my measurements off to the side are larger than my center line measurements. My center line measurements are all pretty good, with this one exception here that's a little bit thick. They're within about 1,000th of what they ought to be. And so I boxed the ones where they're too big. I circled the ones where it ought to get a little smaller. And those are there over here. And then I dotted circled the ones where I want to balance it. And so basically that's saying one side of the reed is thicker than the other side. So I've got some spots. So I marked those spots off, and I scraped the reed in those spots until these measurements got down to where they ought to be. This mapping process that I do, I'm only showing it once. Sometimes I do it 2 or 3 times on a reed, depending on how badly my original scrapings were. Again, you'll see that this is my typical thing where I don't seem to scrape as much on the left side of the reed as I do on the right side, but that's kind of how things are. Okay, so what I want to do is what else did I do on this reed? I also reamed out just a little bit on the vocal end of the reed. As I've mentioned many times, the fibers on the cane get compressed when you form the reed, and so they swell up when it gets wet. Okay, so I will play a chromatic scale and a little bit of a tune here, and then I'll talk about what basically this reed is doing very well. And I'm going to stop my discussions on it here after I play a little bit on it. So. Apologies to all the cello players in the audience. Anyway, so this reed is doing just fine. It needs to be broken in, some time being broken in. As you can see here, looking at the opening is not quite symmetric, and I'll work a little bit on improving the symmetry of that. It's also a little bit closed, and so I'll open that up by squeezing the first wire on the sides. Again, I do very little with wires adjusting as I go along. So I hope you found this little introduction to contrabassoon reeds interesting. Happy reed making.